Welcome to another edition of Friends and Enemies. I'm Jeff Nyquist. I'm in the United States, and my co host Alex Benish is in Germany. And this is the third part of our discussion of World War II. What happened? What are the highlights? And in this discussion, we're emphasizing the influence of course, espionage on the war, and of course, larger strategic issues leading into where we are today, how World War II shaped the world we are living in now, because we're living in a post World War II order with the dollar as a leading trading currency, with the United States as a leading economy and the leader of the Western Alliance versus, during the Cold War, the Soviet Union. And of course, it was this Soviet US combination that was the combination, together with the United Kingdom, that crushed Hitler and Japan, Imperial Japan, in World War II, the Axis powers. So I'm going to hand it over to Alex. You had a few comments you wanted to make on the war, at the latter part of the war, and then maybe we can just sort of discuss the military sequence of events, how Germany collapsed, so people have an overview of how and why that happened.
Sure. I mean, up until almost the very last point, the hope in the German leadership was to reach at least some kind of a deal that would keep the Anglos out for as long as possible. Now, of course, when you're in a war situation like this, you cannot just make a deal with everybody, but you can also make separate peace deals with the different enemies that you have. Now, for the British and the Americans, a lot depended on, let's say, the landing in Normandy. A lot of depended on what happened next. You know, could you actually go deeper into Europe? The weather was, of course, a big problem. I think I mentioned this briefly before. The landing in Normandy was dependent on the weather and the correct weather report. The British had their star weather expert. I think it was either Colonel or Captain James Stagg. After the war, he got all these medals, recommendations, and he became the head of the weather research, which then became climate research. Now, many people don't know this, but weather and climate research were built by the military for the military. And then these weirdo politicians got on top of it, and then they made this fancy computer that supposedly tells us the future and tells us what to do. So a lot of things had to be correct. Now, of course, there was the Allied bombing campaign. This was married to an espionage campaign because, of course, you needed to know where the air defenses would be. There's studies out over the last couple of years detailing some of these interesting spy cases. One of the persons who ended up in the files of various intelligence agencies was Strauss, who became very important in post-war German politics, almost became German chancellor. He was very pro-American, but it seems he sold secrets of the air defense during the war to the Americans, who had a spy operation in Switzerland. So there are all these moving pieces, and they're all really, really important. And then, of course, you had the top spies in the Nazi leadership, especially the Soviet spies, like Martin
Yes.
Bormann and others. And Bormann was not just stealing information and handing it over to the Soviets, but there was also a sabotage of the war effort of the Germans. Maybe one example that people can look up is the airplane, the Me-262, for example. This was a what do you call it in English? A jet propulsion airplane, one of the first
A
of its
jet.
kind.
It was
A
one of the
jet.
first. It was the first effective operational jet fighter, I think,
Yeah,
wasn't
and
it?
so this thing was ready to be made in larger numbers, and Hitler gave the order in 1943 to not have a large number of those planes produced. And now this plane was faster than any other plane. It had a gun made by Rheinmetall. This company still exists to this day, and so the heavy Allied bombers were protected by these smaller airplanes, and the I think it was the Messerschmitt Me 262. These planes could actually attack these convoys and fire these bullets, especially into these heavy bombers, and these heavy bombers could not be protected with these slower planes. That could have changed the situation. Some people estimate that a limited number of Me-262 planes could have protected all of the airspace of Germany,
Yeah,
and
if
even
they'd had
beyond that. So
500 to 1,000 MEs 262s in
yes,
continuous operation, I don't
so
think the
it's
Allied bomber fleets would have been destroyed.
So if people watch these average documentaries on World War II, they may get the idea that the Nazi war machine was sort of perfect and it was overpowering. It had many, many flaws, but still, all kinds of things had to be done right on the side of the Allies. The espionage had to function.
Hmm.
These different military campaigns had to function. Everything had to be coordinated. It was a massive, massive
Yeah, if you
effort. And
had anything go wrong, I mean, this is the thing people don't realize about the war is that people talk about the Russians and the Russian front, which absorbed most of the German army. And this is important. An important book is Death Ride, which is a book by John Mosher, an American academic and a historian, a very good military historian, by the way, a very sensible man, does great analysis. He's the only guy, by the way, that I can think of in academia that called the Ukraine war in advance, said the Russians are going to get hurt invading Ukraine. And of course, in the long term, he thought Ukraine could lose because the West would cut support for Ukraine. But he understood the deficits of the Russian military, which is really essentially still the same as the Soviet military in World War II. And I think what we don't realize is that, people often think, oh, Hitler made this big mistake in attacking Russia. No, his big mistake was antagonizing the U.S.
mhm,
because the U.S. was supplying Russia, was keeping the Russian economy afloat. In fact, Russian aluminum production had collapsed after the German invasion. And so you can hardly make any air weapons without aluminum, right?
yeah,
And that would mean total German domination of the air. The Russians couldn't compete. That's just one example of the areas where the Russians failed. The Russians didn't have machine shops for the tanks, so the Germans would just pick them up off the battlefield, turn them into German tanks. There were all kinds of things working for the Germans to win, that if the Americans hadn't been throwing all these supplies into the Soviet Union, it would have been taken over by the Wehrmacht. The Germans wouldn't have suffered all those casualties. Their armies wouldn't have been pinned down. It would have been
right.
impossible to invade Fortress Europe in 1943, 44, and 45. So
The
just
yeah
to
the
frame that is
Exactly, and the
important.
exactly, and the Americans, they had people like John J. McCloy. Now, he was not seeking fame at the time. He came from a fairly humble background, and he worked his way up, and he made these connections, and he became involved in so many things at once. He was regarded as a genius within the American system, and so they promoted him and gave him more and more responsibility. And at some point, he was this guy coordinating intelligence operations. He was coordinating the military buildup in America, and he was also coordinating the drive to mobilize, I think, up to 12 million American soldiers. Now, this is sort of the American style. He did not come from a gilded family. He was purely basing his career on his abilities, and then, of course, after the war, he became sort of the organizer for the rebuild, the rebuilding of Germany. So this is the kind of person you need to have when you're dealing with a situation like this, because if the American military campaigns had failed, getting into Europe, then of course there may have been a deal with the Americans, a deal with the British, and the Nazis could have also sort of settled with the Russians. Now, this would have created a much different world. I mean, not just for me sitting in Germany today, a much different world, but as you explained so well in one of the previous shows, Stalin already after the war, Stalin was already planning another world war, a third world war, and so this is kind of the situation that could have happened. So imagine the Nazis defending
Mm,
themselves, hanging by a thread. The Nazis mobilizing anything they had, sending in all these teenagers, fending off the Americans, keeping the British out, making a deal with the Russians. But what would have happened with Germany by aligning with the Soviets? Not the Nazi system being so infiltrated by Soviet agents and the Nazi system being so weak. I mean, eventually the Russians could have taken all of Germany, all of the engineering, all of the resources and the
they
technology.
were hoping to do that. In fact, it's very interesting. Of course, the most industrial, this is an important point that and when we get to the end of the war, where is the industrial heartland of Germany? That's an interesting question. And of course, it's in the western part of Germany, not in the
Yes.
eastern part of Germany. It's in the Ruhr, it's in places, it's like Hamburg, it's in these larger industrial cities in the west. This is unfortunate for Stalin because Stalin wants the industrial heartland of Germany. He doesn't want the rural, the rural East Prussia and eastern part of the country. He wants the industrial heartland, and of course, he wants to get there before the Americans do. And this frames the latter part of the war. So let me paint a picture for people for what's happening, how the war developed. The Germans, of course, had their conquest of the Low Countries, France, the Balkans. They conquered Greece, Crete. What eventually happened was they got kicked out of Africa, lost their army, their big army, the in Tunisia in mid 1943, and then of course the Allies invaded Sicily. Was their first amphibious invasion of the European continent. Of well, Sicily's Europe, really, it's part of Italy. And then they came on to Italy and they went up the peninsula. They had two more landings, Salerno and Anzio. So the Americans were practicing this business of amphibious landing, but always Stalin was. They had a conference at Tehran in 1943. Roosevelt and General Marshall, the head of the U.S. military, met with Stalin. Churchill was there at Tehran. And Stalin was all about at this conference, you must land in France, you must have a cross channel landing. And Stalin was demanding a cross channel landing in 1942.
Hmm.
Eisenhower actually came in and told the British, oh, we're going to land in 1942. And the British said, well, how many Americans do you want to die? If we land, we'll lose our whole army in 1942. We'll lose everything. The Germans will smash us. And Eisenhower didn't care because this was the order coming down from Roosevelt and from Marshall. This is why one of the reasons why people like myself, Senator Joseph McCarthy, had these suspicions about Marshall. You would literally sink the Allied cause, destroy the Allied
Hmm.
armies, in the idea of sacrificing men on beaches in France so that Stalin could survive another so
That
many
was just too
months.
much. Yeah.
And you're just pouring all this stuff in. And of course, Churchill and the British generals were like, no, we're not committing suicide. We're not destroying our
Hmm.
army. We absolutely won't. The British put their foot down. We're not invading France. And I think the proposal was September 1942. So they went with invading French Northwest Africa instead. Operation Torch
A
was the
safer
invasion that
option.
happened. And very safe. I mean,
Hmm.
the Vichy French in North Africa barely resisted. There was very little fighting. And of course, then they could fight Rommel directly. And they had a great victory doing that rather than getting themselves. And of course,
Yeah.
at the American Army did not, Second Corps at, we mentioned this last time, at Kasserine Pass, got his head handed to it. The commander was found to be a kind of a drunkard, was replaced by Pat. And Pat was an Army assigned to command 7th U.S. Army. He voluntarily said, well, you're taking a demotion, taking on a corps. He took this thing and then he won. He defeated, I think it was 10th Panzer Division at a battle where this Panzer Division
Yeah.
headed
The
straight into an American infantry division and they actually stopped it.
and
And this is depicted in the movie, at the beginning of the movie, Pat, and that's what's shown. But I read a detailed account of the battle. It was rather amazing. The American equipment was fairly poor,
hmm.
not up to stopping a Panzer Division, but they managed by good leadership, and it was President Teddy Roosevelt's son was the co-commander of the American division that stopped the 10th Panzer Division there. So it was the first American, you could call it the first American victory. So the Americans had some confidence. So Patton landed, was landing with 7th Army. He got relieved from that. It's very funny how the best American commander gets taken out
Why exactly
by,
was that?
well, because he slapped an American soldier who was he's called him a coward because he was shell shocked and he
And
was in with the wounded soldiers.
he got
So Patton was
photographed
saying,
doing
"You're a
this or
coward."
something.
Now, what's funny is the
Did,
guy that he slapped around won a bunch of medals. After he got slapped around, he went back, he got his courage
oh,
back, and he went and won a bunch of medals and said,
uh-huh.
Patton made a hero out of me, right?
Oh boy.
But
Oh boy.
Patton was sidelined for months. He was relieved of command of 7th Army. Later, they brought him back as commander of 3rd Army, but he wasn't involved in the Normandy invasion.
Mm-hmm.
That was run by Montgomery and Eisenhower, and of course General Bradley.
Oh, by the way, even before the Normandy landing, there was what was called the Weather War. People can actually look this up. This was a real thing. Now, this was a series of operations on both sides. The Germans mostly and the British. I think also the Americans, and this was a battle for weather data. Okay, so this is when you had these airplanes stuffed with technology to figure out all kinds of measurements. You had stationary systems on these small islands, I think like Svalbard Island. Also, these ships with sensors and equipment to gather the weather data. And so this was kind of like a race to sink the enemy's ships in that regard, to shoot down the enemy's planes, to prevent the enemy from gathering accurate weather data. And also with the ultra intercepts at Bletchley Park, deciphering the Enigma, this was also done to steal German weather data so the British could get a better forecast for that very day. And there's the famous incident where this forecast was made by the British officer Stagg, who later became the head of climate and weather research. And so he was absolutely convinced that on that particular day the weather would be good, the clouds would be good, the sea would be calm. And the Germans, on the other hand, they had less data. So the Germans were estimating 2 weeks of bad weather. So this is why they sent quite a few officers to have a weekend off or to have a short vacation. This is
in late May, early June 1944.
Yes, and so
on the eve of the invasion.
So this is the difference that weather data makes in war, and also almost at the very last minute, the weather kind of changed a bit around, and this is when Eisenhower, I think, confronted Mr. Stagg and asked him, how do we play this? And Stagg was absolutely convinced to postpone the invasion by a single day because in his estimate, in his mind, it was going to work out, and it ultimately did work
he
out.
Estimated June 6th was the right day. Is that right?
June 6, 1944. Yeah, and so they postponed it by 1 day because of one man.
Yeah.
Because of one man.
Well, it is very significant, and of course we should talk about the Normandy invasion now next because it was the beginning of the end. But people don't realize how incredibly dangerous this landing was, and there's all these people they put Patton in charge of a fake army, and they fed the German spies with fake information about this army going to cross at Calais, right? That's the narrowest point in the channel. And the Germans had their strongest defenses at Calais, which is northern France, rather than at Normandy. Now, Hitler...
Rommel was managing the defenses on the coast.
Rommel was in charge of the defenses, but Rommel was actually in command of something called 7th Army, which was at Normandy. 7th Army wasn't at Calais. Rommel was at Normandy. Now, why was Rommel at Normandy? Because Hitler didn't believe the intelligence that was false. And Hitler had this great sense of intelligence. And he said, oh, no, they're not going to land at Calais. These generals and all this intelligence is wrong. They're landing at Normandy. So Hitler made sure that Rommel was at Normandy with the 7th Army. Now, of course, a lot of heavy divisions, the bulk of the army was at Calais because the generals demanded it, and Hitler was still in a position where he had to be reasonable, right? And there was a danger at Calais. But Hitler had this sixth sense, and he was often right. He was just like he was right when the general said we have to defend Greece because of Operation Mincemeat, which was
Mm-hmm.
where the British floated a dead body
Mm-hmm.
off the coast of Spain. It washed up, and the dead body had the plans for the invasion of Greece
They made a new
rather than
movie out of
Sicily.
that. Yeah, they recently
They
put
did
out a new
make a
movie
movie
out of
out of
it.
it. They did. And I think they made the man whose body they used. They had to ask his family, a man who died of some other illness, and they used his body, and they created a fake identity and a girlfriend and letters and everything to be on his body when it washed up on shore. It was really done amazingly perfect. The Spanish got it. Spanish were kind of authorities there were soft on the Germans and handed the information over to the Germans. And of course, Admiral Canaris was like, "Yeah, they're going to invade. They're going to invade Greece." And Hitler there's actually a recording of his meeting with Canaris, and Hitler turns to his assistant and goes, "They're not invading in Greece. They're invading in
Mm-hmm.
Sicily." Hitler knew. Hitler had the sixth sense. Um, and this is true at Normandy. But the weather thing that you mentioned was decisive because Rommel was a magician. He was a tactical genius. He could use fewer forces and create a victory out of nothing when he's
Mm.
overpowered. It was amazing how he could do it. He just knew. He
He
understood the
always,
logic
yeah,
of war.
and he always used his own little plane. Yeah, they called it a Fieseler Storch, and he would sit in his plane even when it was too dangerous. He did this in Africa. He did this everywhere, and he would fly over these areas to get his own sense of what the battlefield was going to be like. He was very hands
Yeah,
on,
and
but he got
before
himself in trouble with that.
yeah, he even personally interrogated British commandos that were caught on the coast, sort of surveying the coastline. And he personally interrogated them, treated them very nice. He was more chivalrous. He believed to get more with honey than with vinegar.
Hmm.
Um,
Oh, and
and there's
also,
accounts by some of the British who were interrogated by Rommel that came after the war. Um, you were going to say?
oh, before I forget this point, because the espionage always also played an important role on the coast up there, because eventually, one person that was stationed there, I think at the time, was Heinz Felfe with the SD, and he became, after the war, he became one of the
He was a
biggest
communist
moles.
agent.
He
Yeah.
became one of the biggest communist moles in German intelligence, but at the time, he was already suspected of fudging the escape of his colleagues, because his colleagues were smelling that this thing could go completely sideways, and they were already ditching at some point, ditching their clothing, changing their identities. But Mr. Felfet didn't destroy all the files, and he was suspected of doing this on purpose. So maybe that's why he was trusted later as a Soviet agent. And also, Rommel's surrounding, there were also some spies selling information, and eventually Rommel himself got under suspicion, and this is why he was forced to commit suicide. So this all had to work together, the espionage and the military preparations and the weather preparations, to coordinate all of this. This was a gargantuan undertaking. And okay, your microphone is off.
And another coincidence is that Rommel's wife's birthday fell on June 6th. Now, I don't know if the Allies knew this, if this was calculated,
It probably
but
was.
so Rommel thinking, I mean, it's pouring, in France, it's pouring down rain. They've given people leave to go to Paris, many officers. If you read the memoirs of officers attached to Seventh Army, and I've read one of those memoirs, Rommel's recon guy, who ended up being commander of one of the regiments in the Panzer Division that was there on the right wing of the German defenses. Um, they um, they would get the officers were getting leave to go to Paris because it was they're not going to
Mm,
invade. It's not
mm-hmm.
good.
The weather is bad.
Rommel was allowed to go home for his wife's birthday, which was on the invasion day. And of course, Hitler was suffering, would in October, just a few months later, suffer a complete collapse where he almost died. So he was suffering from exhaustion from his micromanaging the war. So he had orders, "Don't wake me up." But what ended up happening was Eisenhower made the gutsy decision to do the invasion, although the weather was off and on again raining. This guy told him it's going to be good enough to
Hmm.
do the invasion. Of course, it's an overcast morning. It had just finished raining, and of course Rommel's not there. And Rommel had an idea of what to do. He had watched those beaches. He knew where they were going to come in. He knew where the dangers were. And of course, the British were landing near Cannes, which is on the far eastern side. The Americans were landing on the western side, right? So it was Gold Beach for the British. It was Omaha and Utah beaches for the Americans, and the Americans dropped their paratroop division, the 101st Airborne, right? And so this was the invasion. It's about you have about 4 or 5 divisions landing right off the bat, and this is infantry. This is not armor. The Germans have their fortified defenses forward, but they have armored divisions in the rear. And the American air power was so great that during the day, the Germans couldn't use the roads
Hmm.
because they'd get bombed and strafed on the roads. They had to move at night. They had, unless it was overcast. If it
Even
was
Rommel got
raining,
strafed later.
Rommel got
Rommel's
wounded and put in
car,
the
yeah.
hospital because his car got strafed because he would dare the odds. He was a very daring. He got away with a lot,
He did.
surviving a lot.
He did.
Yeah. So it was on that morning. Rommel's away. This young man who wrote who was commanding in one of the regiments, he had just come back from Paris on that night, and he was Johnny on the spot. He was trying to do what Rommel would have done. But of course, we don't know what Rommel wanted to react immediately with a giant push, even at night, to drive them into the sea. And that might have been the bold move, because you couldn't, if your troops are all mixed in, you can't use American cruisers, right, that were with their shells attacking the German positions. But if you're on the move, and of course they tried it the next day on the 7th, they tried to counterattack in broad daylight, and that cruiser just started hitting those German troops, and there was no
Hmm.
counterattacking at that point. But on that night, you know what Rommel would have done. He would have immediately gone at them. So it wasn't an easy battle even then, for the Allies were totally hemmed in the hedgerows. They couldn't hardly make any progress forward. The Germans just had them pinned into the coast, and it was quite a grind to break out. And it wasn't until they formed the Third Army and Patton got in command of that Third Army, ironically, and that at that point they had ground the Germans a bit in this forward battling, and they had some good weather, and it was um, they broke out. And they actually broke out not on the British side, where the heaviest German divisions were facing the British, but on the American side, where Patton was. They broke out at Normandy. And at the same time, on the Eastern Front, this tremendous disaster happened where the German Army Group Center, which had no significant armored reserves behind it, because the Russians had fooled the Germans into thinking that they were going to invade Romania, where the oil was. So Hitler, being paranoid of losing the oil, had his Panzer Reserve down further to the south. So there was the German Central Armies vulnerable, and they were defending Minsk in a kind of a salient, which was vulnerable to a double envelopment attack, and
Yeah.
it destroyed the Central Army Group. So at the same time, the Allies are breaking out from Normandy, the Germans' Eastern Front collapses. So it's a double catastrophe
The
for Germany
British
all of a sudden.
the British had an alternative plan which was called Operation Vegetarian. This was supposed to be ready in 1944 as well. And this plan envisioned the use of anthrax cookies. These were supposed to be dropped from airplanes, sort of over a corridor over Germany, and the cattle, the animals would eat those biscuits, those cookies, and get sick with anthrax. And there was quite a number of these cattle cookies produced. I think this was Port and Down's responsibility, and the Americans also produced some. Why do you think this option was not used in 1944?
Well, I've read the sources on this one. I read Biological Warfare. The U.S. actually set up a plant for making anthrax, weaponizing anthrax in Boise, Idaho, of all places. The British tested it on an island off the coast of Scotland. I forget the name of the island, but
Grenard? Was it Grenard Island?
I think so. I think that's the name. And it's only recently been inhabitable again.
Mm-hmm.
Because anthrax, the thing about anthrax, it's a long lived spore. And especially the further north you are, the more long lived it is because it's prolonged exposure to heat that destroys the
Spores.
bacteria. And what it does is it rain tends to knock it into the soil, so it exists in the soil underneath grass where it's cool, where it can live. It likes cool and cold. And the cattle you can get. George Washington actually suffered from anthrax, from undercooked meat. If a cow eats
Oh
anthrax,
no.
it can be in the cow, and if you don't cook cow good enough, it takes a lot to kill a cow. Gastrointestinal anthrax is about 30 to 60% fatal.
Lethal, yeah.
Washington did survive his bout of anthrax at the beginning of his first term
Because
as
he didn't
president.
breathe. Because he didn't breathe it, he ate it.
He didn't breathe it, he ate it. But if you breathe it, it's like 98,
Mm-hmm.
99% fatal, right? If you breathe it. And this was the thing the Allies had, besides trying to contaminate cattle, they were thinking of dropping large amounts of aerosolized anthrax over Berlin. That was the original idea they had. And Churchill was pushing it, as I remember in the readings, but the problem is that they realized that this stuff's when they put it somewhere in that quantity, it could stay around for,
100
50,
years
60, 80,
yeah.
100 years, right? So that area becomes permanently contaminated and uninhabitable as far as the lifespan of people living and even their grandchildren. So they thought that's too harsh.
Permanent.
It's too permanent, right? And they said we don't, and it was expensive. And they said, why do we can bomb it? Why do we need to drop anthrax? Do something crazy like that. And they also probably realized that the Germans had nerve agent that they could dump on London.
Mm.
So if they did something like that, used an unconventional warfare method, who knows what, the Germans might have anthrax and might drop it on London. So unconventional weapons
Yeah.
carry this danger that the other side
There's
might have it.
wasn't there an incident on the Eastern Front where the Russians were suspected of using what they call it, tularemia?
Tularemia, they did in fact, there was congressional testimony from a Russian defector from the bio-war program in the 1980s. This is not Ken Alabek. I'm not remembering his name, but it was an earlier defector from the same program. I think his testimony was 87, 88. And yes, I read that testimony in the congressional record. They fired the tularemia out of artillery. They modified artillery shells, and
Like a feather bomb, or what they call it, like a
yeah, and of course the Germans were unaware of being infected by it, but the shells themselves must have contaminated the Russian troops who came down with it.
mm-hmm.
So the Russians got it and the Germans didn't. So the Russians discontinued it because they didn't really understand what went wrong. Of course, if you had shoddy production of these shells, it makes sense that you would have contaminated your own troops and maybe had done nothing to the Germans. The Germans were famously fastidious and cleanly. The Russian troops not so much. So you had a much greater hygiene problem among the Russian troops in the war. And the Russian troops, it wasn't necessarily their fault. They weren't given the supplies
Mm-hmm.
to do all the cleaning and keep themselves fit. Russian troops were poorly supplied compared to the Germans. So it was an experiment that failed. Stalin, by the way, in the 1930s had experimented with bubonic plague in Mongolia, and actually they caused a plague in
Mm-hmm.
Mongolia in the 30s. This is also brought out in some of the testimony that came out of the Soviet Union. So it wasn't for want of trying to
Yeah.
create a biological weapon.
Maybe we should briefly mention the other thing, which was the German atomic program. Now, according to the material, the data we have, the Germans could have had a bomb, I think, in 1947. That was the projection, if a whole lot of money would have been spent on it. Now, there's, of course, different opinions on that, but we know, of course, that. We know, of course, about researchers like Heisenberg. We know about the Norwegian operation with the heavy water. We know about a 60-ton cyclotron. I think that was already in place. And we also know about a vast amount of uranium that was at the end of the war hidden from the Americans. And the Americans had a special team to find anything of great significance. And they did ultimately find the uranium hidden behind containers with lead, so you wouldn't pick them up as easily.
Also,
In
the Japanese had their atomic bomb project. I think we mentioned this before. They were begging Hitler for the uranium to make a bomb. And actually, I know a friend of mine, his uncle was the flyer who destroyed the Japanese submarine carrying the uranium that Hitler had given them in the Atlantic. It was a Japanese I boat. They called them I boats. They were very large. Japanese submarines were the largest submarines of the war. And they had loaded the submarine with uranium for Japan. There was a U boat that was also loaded with uranium that was supposed to deliver it to Japan, and that U-boat surrendered it, put it in New England, and you can bet that the Truman administration was extremely alarmed at a German U-boat carrying uranium, putting it in New England. Um, and this is there's a book on this that came out in the 90s. There was a number of declassified things. So
yeah,
the Japanese were working on their atomic bomb. How far along they were. There's one book that claims that they could have made it even before we did, but I'm kind of skeptical of that.
well, we have to
One thing is
remember
for,
the yeah,
yeah,
we have to remember the extreme effort that was made first with the tube alloys project in Britain, and then they moved what they had to America, and then it really began, in Los Alamos and other places, and it was going from imagine having to do 100 steps, and from one step to the other there are hundreds of permutations, and you potentially have to go through all of them to get to the next
mm,
step, and then it's the same game all over again. You have to just do every permutation, every variant, and then you get to the next step. So the Germans were
yeah.
not really equipped to do that. A, for the
No, they
money,
didn't
and
have the depth and the number of engineers and scientists. One advantage America had a tremendous number of engineers and very clever physicists. And we had
Enrico,
physicists
yeah,
from Germany, Italy. We had physicists from
Enrico
Europe,
Fermi,
all over
and
Europe.
yeah, Enrico Fermi, all these geniuses, and
Yeah.
the German, I mean the leadership of Nazi Germany, especially Hitler, he considered nuclear physics to be sort of a Jewish science. So he was not really. He had reservations about it on ideological grounds, and he was not in tune with technology. I mean, when it came to some of
Yeah, the
these,
Nazis anti-Semitism thing, and we should talk about the Holocaust here, because it's something that started after Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, the Wannsee Conference in early 19, what was it, March of 1942? Was that the Wannsee, or was it April? And this is the conference where they set up the transportation system and the organization of the Holocaust, moving people from the Jewish ghettos to the concentration camps. There had been, of course, atrocities against the Jews before then, but this was the idea of the systematic elimination of the Jews. And I just wondered what you thought. Why, it's so insane, right? You're
mm-hmm,
incarcerating people, you're taking away their homes, you're taking away their possessions, you're crowding them into ghettos, you're making them wear little yellow stars. You're doing it all over Europe, not just in Germany, not just in general government, which was the area of former Poland, where they set up some of these camps. But also, you're doing it in the Low Countries in France. You ultimately round up all the Jews in Italy, in the parts of Italy that the Germans controlled in 1943, and you're sending them all to camps. Your ally Hungary,
Mm-hmm.
you take all the Hungarian Jews when the Admiral Horthy government is overthrown by the Nazis, when he decides to try to quit the war, and they're taking hundreds of thousands of Hungarian Jews. So, I mean, you're German. You grew up among people. I mean, what do people in Germany say about this? I mean, is it, Americans? A lot of Americans say they had to all know. It must have been common knowledge. What do you say?
Well, there are studies about this that emphasize sort of the secrecy and the organizational logistics of it. So you would try to have the logistics out of sight. You would try to be somewhat covert about it when it comes to the
Yeah, you
general
don't you don't
population.
want to you don't
It
want to wear
it's
murderer
yeah,
tattooed
but
across your
I mean,
forehead, right?
it wasn't so. They did try to hide it from the general population, but this undertaking was so large, and this is what Holocaust researchers emphasize all the time. This undertaking was so large that it did take quite a number of people with high level of organization to pull this off. So this left so many data points. I mean, some of the higher up documents were disappeared, of course, but all the other documentation was still in place, and this is something that divides the Holocaust researchers from the revisionists. And we've talked about Russian influence on the
On
revisionists,
revisionism, yeah.
because it's designed to recruit people for certain things. And the Holocaust researchers, they point to this mountain of data that's so large that even the historians haven't even covered all of it yet.
It's huge. Yeah,
Even
it is
even
huge. I mean,
Raoul
but as
Hilberg. I
far as
mean,
the smoking gun, is there anything better that you know of than Himmler's Posen speech, which you can listen to it on
it's just,
YouTube. You can listen to that speech.
I think it's it. Well, you can still
Because that's
find.
really a
Yeah,
confession.
you still can
I've
find.
talked to two revisionists, and I said, who were applying this stuff, and I said, well, haven't you listened to the
Yeah.
Posen speech? I mean, it's a confession, and
Yeah,
it
but it's
pretty
it's like
clear.
it's like this. It's like some people they demand, the revisionists, for example, they will demand a perfect written statement on camera, on microphone, everything. They want the
Right.
perfect one little gimmicky thing, and if that cannot be produced, then they will deny the whole thing. But there's a mountain of data, obviously, and there's a book that really goes into that as well is this is the book IBM in the Holocaust by Edwin Black, and he's also done another book which is great, which is War Against the Weak, which was about the older eugenics movement that was copied by the Nazis. So this had a long backstory, and so in the book IBM in the Holocaust, you will get to hear the story of these punch card tabulating machines, like an early computer. And these machines had it specifically made for specific tasks. So it was not a universal computer like we're using today. You can run all kinds of software on it. This had to be made for one purpose, like managing trains or managing the Holocaust. So, even when they had these machines in place, they still needed to gather all the data up to the last little dinky town in the middle of nowhere. They sent people out to figure out who was born when, who was part Jewish, and everything. And only when you had that mountain of data, you could feed it through the machine. It would sort out according to the attributes who is a Jew according to this, and then they had these lists. So when the Einsatzgruppen and other units, they would go into these territories that had been cleared by the military, they already had the perfect lists. And many people in these dinky little towns on the countryside, many people thought they were kind of safe because they were not practicing Jews. They may have had a Jewish grandmother or whatever. They thought they were safe because they didn't figure out the effort that went into the pre-research of it. So the Nazis came, or the Einsatzgruppen came, and they had these perfect lists. They knew exactly what person to grab and to deport. And then, of course, just the the logistics left so much data for people to go through. And this is the area that the revisionists try to avoid. They're always saying, well, we're looking for these perfect, ironclad, written, signed admissions from the high ranking Nazis. That's the only thing that matters, but they ignore the mountain of data. They go to places where they think they can win in an argument, but they completely ignore where they would lose an argument. And I said that they wanted to keep the Holocaust somewhat away from the general public, but because there were so many people involved in it and the logistics of it, these people involved, they knew other people in the general population because everybody had brothers and sisters and fathers and cousins. So people did talk, and so this was not something you could keep secret that well. And even in America, even in the New York Times, I think the New York Times and other newspapers, and people can read that in the book IBM and the Holocaust. Even American newspapers were saying there's a Holocaust going on. This is terrible. And right or pretty close to the headquarters of the newspaper was the IBM headquarters, and they had a tie to the German Hollerith Corporation, which was making these punch card tabulating machines. So there was a lot of interlocking, and also in the book IBM and the Holocaust, the author, Mr. Black, he had up to 1,000 people helping him, and they really needed to make a great effort to find out how systematic it was, how this corporation, this Hollerith Corporation, and these researchers were going into the Nazi researchers, they were going into these territories even before, or during an invasion, collecting all this data. And then these tabulating machines could be used in that way. So this was a huge thing. And so people knew, even if you didn't see it in your day-to-day, life, you could still, you were related to somebody who knew.
Well, I had a fascinating, I was curious when I was doing some research at one point, and I knew somebody that knew how to get in touch with the head of the Institute for Historical Review in California, which was Willis
Yeah.
Carto. It's a what do you call it? It's a historical revisionist, pro-Hitler kind of thing. And I talked to the head of it. I'm not going to use his name. I asked him about the Posen speech, and he was very frank with me. He said he didn't deny the Holocaust, which shocked me. And this was several years ago. He didn't deny the Holocaust. He said that if you looked at this, really shocked me, and I guess he'd done a paper on this, if I'm remembering right. He said that Hitler basically admitted the whole thing in a very oblique way in his last will and testament. Have you ever heard this before?
No. It's but it all goes back to him ultimately, because the entire Nazi view on history was biological. They wanted this gimmick because usually history is very complex and you need all kinds of different kinds of expertise. But if you create a gimmick, if you say it's biological, you can explain politics and security, you can explain imperialism, everything. You can explain it with biology. Then it becomes sort of the essence of everything. And even if you explain communism as being Jewish, right? So then you've completely mixed two separate things, because real life socialism is a gimmick in and of itself. But then you combine two gimmicks in a new way, and you say, well, this devilish communism is essentially Jewish, and of course people have claimed that capitalism is Jewish and greed is Jewish.
Devilish.
Greed
right?
is Jewish. Having financial enterprises is Jewish, and making profits is Jewish, and being profitable
money
is Jewish.
Yeah,
Loaning money is Jewish.
Claim.
It becomes sort of this all-encompassing gimmick. And as I've mentioned before, the Nazis understood counterintelligence as killing Jews, because in European history, obviously some Jewish people had been forced to cooperate with the empires, and they had to do some espionage. And but overall, there were some instances where restrictions were placed on Jews. Sometimes they were expelled from a country, then they were allowed back into the country to tax them. And so there were different ways that tyrannical systems would treat Jews, but the Nazis thought we needed a final solution. And the final solution, the term has a double meaning. It's not just about the killing of Jews per se, it's also about killing their imagined magical powers of subversion. Because for thousands of years...
What is it in German? Die Endlosung der Judenfrage?
Exactly. That's exactly it. So
the final solution to the Jewish question?
Yeah, exactly. People always think it just means the physical destruction of Jews, but it was the primary goal was to destroy the magical abilities of Jews to wreck empires,
and
starting with the Roman Empire.
The German euphemism for killing, was it special treatment?
Sonderbehandlung.
What is that in German?
Sonderbehandlung, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that was...
yeah.
And so by killing Jews, you would essentially, that was the idea, you would break that multi-millennia cycle of Jews wrecking empires, starting with the Roman Empire. All these good empires went bust, they thought, because of Jewish influence. The French Empire, the Roman, the Russian Empire, the Tsarist Empire, and they also thought that the British Empire was going soft and it was taken over by Jews, and they thought that the Austrian, empire was soft and stupid.
Sure.
So the wreckers of empires. If you wanted a Roman-style empire, which the Nazis attempted to be, they wanted to be better than Rome. If you wanted to achieve that, you need to destroy Jews. Otherwise, you suffer the same fate as the Romans.
And in Mein Kampf, I don't really recommend people read it because it's rather sickening. I made myself read it about 10 years ago. And at one point, I thought, I don't know if I can read this anymore. The anti-Semitism was so sickeningly thick in it that you start to get this ill feeling in your stomach about it. And one of the things Hitler says in Mein Kampf is that there's three kinds of peoples: civilization creating peoples, civilization preserving peoples, and civilization destroying peoples. And of course, he classified the Jews as civilization destroyers, right?
Yeah,
which is really sinister when you think of that way of describing a whole people.
Yeah, and also these tabulating punch card machines, these early mechanical computing machines that the Nazis used, they were dependent on the variables you would enter into the machine. So, for example, you wanted to classify who is a Jew. What makes a Jew, right? And the Nazis
what was the Nazi criteria? Was having one Jewish grandparent? Was that
it? Was they picked the least amount of, or the smallest amount of factors. So they could have chosen other factors that would have maybe put 2 million people, 1.5 million people into the crosshairs, but they chose a wider net. They programmed, or let's say mechanically entered different variables into these machines so that people were targeted who were mostly German at that point, because before the Nazis, some of these ancient medieval laws were actually changed, and these laws over here, they used to say you cannot socialize with Jewish people. So you cannot have your Jewish neighbor over for dinner. Your kids cannot play with each other. You cannot socialize.
An Aryan can't date a Jewish person or marry them. That was absolutely the Nuremberg laws, right?
Yeah.
You were forbidden to marry a Jewish person.
But even before that, even in the centuries before that, you were not allowed to socialize with Jewish people, and when that changed, people just became friends. Sometimes they married, and it was increasingly different. It was increasingly difficult to look at a person and say this person is Jewish or not, because everybody was wearing the same clothing. They were talking more or less the same way.
Right.
And some people were not even practicing Jews anymore. They may have had a Jewish grandmother, Jewish grandfather. So even Germans who had some Jewish background got into the crosshairs, and nowadays you get these databases of photos that were made, sort of like the mugshots of the Holocaust, right? Or
Well,
the
and
rounding up
I should
process.
say this. I had, I'm old enough. I can say I grew up knowing Holocaust survivors, and I had a teacher in high school, a very nice lady. She was German Jewish lady. She survived the Holocaust by getting out of Germany into Switzerland. Her brother joined the Wehrmacht and pretended to be,
Mm-hmm.
and her brother had blonde hair and and blue eyes. He pretended to be a Nazi to
Yeah.
survive the war.
Exactly, because if you look at some
And
of these
yeah,
photos that survived, a lot of these people on the photos, they look spectacularly German, and so this made this ideological drive even more insane if you think about it. And if you look at the literature, and I did this whole review on Nazi conspiracy literature and what came before, they couldn't even agree on what a Jewish person is, how
yeah,
to actually recognize a Jew,
anthropologically.
how to
Hmm.
recognize a Jew, and they sort of it was almost it was almost like reading the tea leaves, so to say. So you had to kind of feel it, and you had to sort of be experienced, and then you could tell if somebody was a Jew, and ultimately this became sort of a free for all. Just you could designate somebody a Jew if you wanted, and this happened even to me when I did some reports on this. People said, "Oh, you," meaning me, I must be Jewish, and I said, "No, especially my ancestors were high-ranking Nazis." But this is how it happens. If you disagree with somebody, they call you a Jew, even though you're
Right.
more Nazi. Your ancestors were more Nazi than their
Because
ancestors.
to them you have Jewish ideas, you see.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
yeah, it's really a very destructive way of dividing people up and destroying people. I should mention this. It's interesting detail. Felix Kirsten was Himmler's doctor and confessor who treated Himmler for the severe stomach cramp symptoms that he got because of what Hitler made him do. And in Kirsten's, you know, autobiography, he actually didn't read it. He told the story to a writer. An incredible story because he was on the inside. He was treating Himmler when Himmler was given the order to carry out the Holocaust. And this is a remarkable story that Kirsten tells, and many historians don't want to believe this. But you know what Himmler did when Hitler gave him the order to murder the Jews, according to Kirsten?
Oh, what?
Himmler's first reaction was, I can't do that. I can't mass murder all these people,
Oh
which is
no.
like a normal person's
Yeah.
reaction, right? But then Himmler was just, and Hitler just was enraged at him. And he was so terrified of Hitler's rage and that he had disappointed his hero. And he was confessing this to Kirsten, and Kirsten was saying, "Well, you did the right thing, saying no,
Hmm.
right?"
Yeah, and
But
also,
Himmler's going, "No, he's I'm
and
going to lose his respect. I'm not going
oh
to, he's
god.
not going to love me anymore, right?"
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
Himmler was doubly eager to perform the Holocaust to make it up for Hitler for refusing him the first time he asked him.
Oh boy, and also the at the time, killing large numbers of people was very doable. I mean, this is something that people sometimes they don't understand because they're not reading books that much, especially only a fraction, well, a large fraction, but still a fraction of the victims of the Holocaust, a fraction died in the camps, in a mechanical fashion. Others, large numbers, were shot in these organized missions, and also there's a big factor which is just malnutrition and disease. Now, when the Nazis were researching biological agents, they were demanding fresh prisoners, and the researchers kept complaining that they were sending them weakened prisoners. So if you tested biological agents on them, this would not give a realistic picture because they wanted to test how would a healthy person well-nurtured person react to these pathogens. So killing a large number of people at the time was very, very doable. If it's a war situation and there's no medical system really to speak of,
Right.
and these people are already very weak once they reach a camp. And sometimes, with these work camps and these work programs, when they worked on the V2 rocket or they worked on anything under the sun, if you're not getting a lot of calories, if you're not getting adequate sleep because you're sharing the same bunk with 3 other people and there's lice and there's all kinds of
And of
problems.
course, illness and lice, right, exactly, would
Yeah.
go through these camps.
And so
Yes.
yeah, and so these logistics were just doable, just very, very much doable at the time. And sometimes, when people make the comparison between the Holocaust and the Soviet gulags, when you make these comparisons, you get a lot of anger from leftists or pro-Russian people because they always claim you want to downplay the Holocaust by playing up the gulags. Now, of course, these operations were different in some regards, but for the Soviets, you were a target if you disagreed, if you had foreign family contacts, if you were needed to build a canal, these projects. So it was just the age of those kinds of logistics. And especially if you pick people in Russia or in the Soviet Union to go to these camps, you can calculate how many people should survive. You can designate how many calories they get per day. You have experience with other people that came before, so you can calculate how many people you're going to murder, essentially, by work in the Soviet Union. And so this was a system that was very much doable, even when we're talking about millions of people. Of course, the Germans were already working on pathogens. So if the Nazis had actually survived, if these American campaigns had failed, the military campaigns of the Americans had failed, the Germans may have developed a larger biological weapons program. And then, of course, even larger numbers of people could have been killed, in a war.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's a lethal. I mean, totalitarian regimes have this lethality. And I should mention there's a book for those who are interested in, and you mentioned this, the machine-like efficiency of the Holocaust. There's a book called Treblinka, which goes into how the Holocaust was organized, how the psychological warfare involved, how they would tell a group of Jews, this is when the Einsatz were killing them by shooting people in the East. Look, yes, we're going to kill some of you, but there's this fork in the road, and one of them leads to where we're going to shoot everybody, and the other one leads to a village where we're going to let everybody live. So that way they could get the rabbis and the Jewish community leaders to lead everybody down that road. And then somehow the psychology of the Germans architects of the Holocaust was, if the Jews thought that they had a chance and that they had a decision, they wouldn't resist. When you look at the small number of guards, if the number of people there knew they were going to die and got desperate and turned on the guards, they would have overwhelmed the guards.
Yeah, and Jews, right? I mean, for so long, Jews had to survive through pragmatism. And I think that carried over into the Nazi era. And that, of course, when it became sort of the wrong choice, this pragmatism. And also, I think with Hitler, I strongly suspect that Hitler poisoned his own father, and that became a seminal moment in his personality, because murdering Jews was a way to achieve a goal. Then Hitler wanted to achieve counterintelligence. He wanted to get rid of what he thought was the essence of communism and destruction of empires. So by using poison gas, you just destroy the obstacle in your way. And I think that's what Hitler did with his own father, because if we remember, Hitler hated his own father. He was a very violent guy. And also his father did not want young Adolf to become an artist. And Hitler hated school. He wanted out of school. So when his father suddenly died, it solved many problems of young Adolf, and it was just exactly what he wanted. He got his revenge.
Young Adolf had motive and opportunity, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, nowadays, and I looked at this over and over again, and I compared it with modern, standards of police investigations and the judicial system. And by today's standards, this would have been an investigation. Even his father would have been investigated because I suspect his father poisoned his 3 wives, but that's another topic. But just Adolf poisoning his own father, that served the revenge purpose. It served his Adolf's career purpose. It solved getting rid of that obstacle in his home. It solved so many problems of Adolf using just a little bit of poison that you could buy anonymously everywhere. And then this later Holocaust of using poison gas to kill Jews was pretty much just
Actually,
an
they used
extension of
Zyklon
that.
B, right? They used a delousing agent in
Hydrogen
concentrated
I
form.
think it was it was technically, it was hydrogen cyanide. It was something. I mean, if
Yeah.
you buy the powder form, you could do this. I mean, this actually happened a lot in Austria in Hitler's days. It was so bad, it was later called Erbschaftspulver. That means inheritance powder. If you want to inherit something, you could kill an old person by poisoning his coffee
Hmm.
with something you could buy at any pharmacy anywhere out of town where nobody knows you. And
And ironically, the German leadership at the end of the war were handed cyanide pills to bite
yeah,
down on and kill themselves, right?
exactly. And yeah, something I should also mention as well is something in my notes here. This was in the later stage of this was in the late stage of the war. Hitler wanted to give the order. Hitler wanted to give the order to destroy all kinds of things within the German Empire. So just to
The
leave,
Ruhr area, the industrial, but
yeah,
basically he wanted to destroy the things the Allies were going to take and that
yeah.
Stalin would not get,
So you couldn't
basically.
rebuild, yeah, and also whoever controlled Germany afterwards could not properly rebuild Germany, and so the people would suffer because he didn't want anybody else to have
Now,
it.
I have a theory about this that we need to get into. So the Allies defeat the German fronts in the east and the west are collapsing, and the Allies are advancing on Paris, and the Germans are heading towards Warsaw. And then something funny happens. And this is something I think historians, and I've talked to at least one historian about this, Mr. Meekin, the one that wrote Stalin's War. I spoke to him about this. I said, you need to research this because this is what I found. Um, Stalin destroys Army Group Center. He's advancing on Warsaw. The Germans don't have a front anymore. They can't form a continuous front. And yet, the Warsaw, the Polish Home Army rebels at Warsaw and the surrounding areas. Polish people have been arming themselves for this moment, thinking the Soviet army is going to be their liberators. What happens is all of a sudden the Soviet army and the German army stop fighting each other and start both fighting the Polish home army.
Hmm.
Have you heard this before?
Well, I remember some of it. I mean, they still have museums where they show these Polish army fully automatic submachine guns. I think it was a modified British Sten design, and
Mm-hmm.
so they had some ambitious plans. They had really some ambitious plans, and this goes into
Yeah.
something that I have in my notes about something that even happened before the war, that also happened during the war and right after the war, which was the plan that was hatched in Britain, which was actually interesting. Before World War II, they wanted to create a safe corridor in Eastern Europe. So this was supposed to be like going through Poland and even Ukraine to have this sort of divider in Europe to protect against fascism from the West and communism from the East. They called it Intermarium. There was also a Promethean League organization, and people were recruited by the British to create this corridor so people would be safe from either fascism or communism. And this plan was almost resurrected after the war, but these plans were scrapped. And I think that some of these Kim Philby types had very much something to do
Oh
with
yeah,
it.
and the Russians ran operations where they what was it called in Poland? They had their own trust operation in Poland. and in which they created a fake Polish home army and they got the Western allies to support it. Then they basically arrested everybody and they made a ha ha on you broadcast. But the Polish home army was serious. It was a real deal. And the Nazis smashed it and the Soviets let them. And the Soviets attacked elements of it that were in their path. And and this is the thing now that's really strange. It's in the biography of Reinhard Gehlen, the head of Foreign Armies East. He was part of the German military intelligence for the Eastern Front, for the whole Eastern Front. And General Gehlen had discovered in 1943 that Martin Bormann, the head of the Nazi Party, Hitler's right arm, was running a series of transmitters sending secret coded messages to Stalin in Moscow. And Admiral Canaris had made the discovery as well, and they had gotten together and said, "What is this? Is Martin Bormann a Soviet agent? He's sending coded message." So they both, Bormann, and this is in Reinhard Gehlen's memoirs, The Service, it's called, and they went to Hitler, and they said, "This is what Bormann is doing." And Hitler said, "Well, of course, this is my back channel to Stalin. This is done on my instructions." Now, this leads into a huge subject about a civil war within the Third Reich and how Martin Bormann, as a Soviet agent, had captured Hitler. In a sense, almost Hitler had become the controlled asset of a Soviet agent.
Oh yeah, by the
And
way,
this is, yeah,
there's a wordplay in the German language, right? Because people know the term der Führer, with the Hitler's preferred term, the leader, but there's also a term which is called der Geführte, which means someone who is being led, or in the intelligence meaning somebody who is being handled by somebody else. So this is why I call one of my books in German der Geführte, he who was led, he who was recruited, or he who was handled, instead of der Führer, he who was the leader. This is exactly
and
it.
And so there's more on this, and of course it really is sinister. When you go to Walter Schellenberg's memoirs, it becomes very clear because Schellenberg spells it out. Although he doesn't say it in a vulgar way, he explains it by the events that he witnessed, and the fact that he had to mount submachine guns into his desk for fear of Martin Bormann, for fear of Heinrich Müller, the head of the Gestapo. So this is one SS general defending himself against others because Walter Schellenberg was considered a liberal SS, pro-Western in his views, preferred the West to the East, preferred the Western allies to the Soviets if the war was going to be lost, whereas Martin Bormann and Heinrich Müller were really working for Stalin. And this is something that Felix Kirsten alludes to from his knowledge from inside the SS, being a confidant of Heinrich Himmler. Very much of Kirsten's memoirs coincide with Schellenberg's. Now, what Hitler, saying this is my back channel to Moscow, it is quite apparent that with the defeat of the German army, Germany's collapsing, the Russians could go, there's a straight path from Army Group Center to Berlin over the flat open ground of Poland. There's just a few rivers to cross. You've got the Bug, you've got the Vistula, you got the Oder River. You basically cross those barriers. It's just a straight path to Berlin. And it's great for tanks and huge armies like the Russians had to do it. What do the Russians do? They suddenly sort of stop advancing forward. They fight the Polish Home Army. And from the end of August 1944 until like the 11th of January 1945, when the Battle of the Bulge is wrapped up, they are not pressing in on Germany. They're invading Romania. They're clearing a pocket in the Baltics. They're pushing on Finland, and they're invading Romania and Hungary and Bulgaria and Yugoslavia. They're coming in that way into the Balkans to get there before the British could, right? Because the British wanted to get into those areas first to prevent those countries from falling to the Soviet Union, falling to communism. So here you have this thing. And so the second part of this is what happens in these 7 months. You have the last German offensive, which starts on 16th of December 1944, which Hitler had to have spent many weeks if not months. I think it was conceived in October, in which you have the Allies, the Americans have just fought this tremendous battle, the Battle of Hurtgen Forest, where it really bloodied American 18th Army Group. Um, I think it was American First Army was the army that engaged there, and this is part of Bradley's army group. There's basically 5 American armies operating in Western Europe at this time in 2 army groups, and this is just disastrous for the Americans because their forces are exhausted, and all of a sudden, and it was done without any warning from anybody. The Soviets didn't warn the Americans with all their inside spies inside the Third Reich. Hitler managed to assemble 2 Panzer armies, the last two full strength Panzer armies that Germany has, and a field army to attack this exhausted American army group that's really spread out thin in the Ardennes forest. In this is around Belgium, France area, coming together with Luxembourg and the German border, and they mass this attack and they hit the Americans with everything the Third Reich has in overcast weather where the American Air Forces and British Air Force cannot intervene. And they just shatter the American line. They cut the American army group in half. They split it into 2 parts. In fact, it's so dire that Bradley gives up command of the northern part of it to Montgomery, whose British army is up against the Rhine in the north. And the danger is, people don't realize how dangerous this was. The German breakout, and it was so stunning that if they had been able to turn north and cross up into the backside of the British army, they could have cut the British army off in Holland. Now, you say, well, there were ports, there was Antwerp, and the Germans had mined all of that. So it was unusable. None of those ports were usable to the Allies. The British army would have been in position, and they couldn't have rescued them either because it was the middle of winter. You couldn't do another, a rescue operation like you had on the beaches of France in 1940. So you would have destroyed the entire British army, trapped it in the winter. You would have shattered the American army group, and it would have been the end. In fact, the British were in such a panic when Churchill spoke to Eisenhower, and there's some letters that Eisenhower wrote. Churchill said, "It's that serious?" The British rose. It was they actually recruited between 200 and 250,000 men into arms. They were so panicked by this. And on the Eastern Front, if you read Guderian's memoirs carefully, Guderian describes while this attack is going on the Americans, and they hear all these, there's 16 Russian armies, bearing down on Germany. And according to Guderian's diaries, the Germans are outnumbered on the Eastern Front 7-1.
Uh-oh.
And there's these letters that still exist from Eisenhower to Marshall, which Eisenhower is saying, where are the Soviets? Why aren't they attacking? Why are we taking the full brunt of this on our own? Stalin is just sitting there watching it, eating popcorn, enjoying the whole thing.
And
right?
Stalin's equipment came from America.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Now it gets better. I got very interested in this, so I wanted to find out what from the German side I could see. And what really turned me on to this was that, well, that's to come. There is a fragment of the speech that Hitler gave to all the officers and the generals, the top officers and generals of the 3 armies that were going to do the Battle of the Bulge. And these were under Army Group A under the Führer's fireman, Field Marshal Walter Model, right?
Model.
You know this name. He was the guy that actually reputedly saved the Eastern Front a number of times from collapsing. They put him on the Western Front. He famously stopped the Operation Market Garden. He stopped Montgomery's attempt to cross the Rhine, which had happened just before this too. The British Army tried this, and Eisenhower, according to Montgomery's memoirs, Eisenhower had promised help from Ninth Army, U.S. Ninth Army. That help never came, and the British advance did not reach Arnhem in time to rescue First British paratroop division that got trapped on the wrong side of the. They were trying to grab this bridgehead at Arnhem to get the British Army over the Rhine before the Germans could react. Brilliant strategy, by the way, absolutely brilliant strategy, but it failed. And again, Eisenhower playing this. If you read, there's a lot of bitterness in backhanded compliments to Eisenhower and Montgomery's memoirs. It's fascinating to read Montgomery's memoirs on this, but you have all this, and Model is very loyal to Hitler, and he's hearing the speech, and Hitler is lying. Hitler is telling his troops this could make the war end on terms favorable to
Mm-hmm.
Germany if we smash the Allies. And then he tells his troops, if you go back and read the transcript of his speech, he tells them that he's negotiating with the Western Allies, which we know is a lie. The Western Allies were not negotiating with Hitler in the fall of 1944. That was not happening. But we know from hints that we've got from Schellenberg and from Reinhard Gehlen that Hitler was negotiating. He had his back channel to Stalin. He was negotiating with Stalin, and we could see the negotiation in the fact that the Soviet armies were not moving
Ooh, that was
at that
close.
time, right? And to make it worse, now this is the other angle that's nasty. Just before the Battle of the Bulge, George Marshall, the head of the U.S. Army, cuts all the replacements from the U.S. armies. Yeah, I'm not giving you any replacements. When General Omar Bradley, and this is in a recent biography of Bradley, asked him, why are you cutting this? Bradley says, George Marshall says, well, because you'll be more careful with your men. And then
Uh,
later, when the Battle of the Bulge begins, he says, well, you got to give us replacements now. No, I need them for Operation Olympic, which is horrific, right? It's going to, if we did it, 1 million Americans would have died. That's more than twice as many that or died or
whew.
wounded that were died and wounded in the whole war on the American side, which is insane. And Marshall wants to do this, invade Japan, right? Which is not necessary. Japan's an island. It's surrounded. They're starving. We have atomic bombs. It's crazy. But this is what Marshall wants. And of course, this sort of sets up the background, the suspicious background of this Battle of the Bulge, this cutting off of
So you
reinforcements.
think that? So you think that because you talked about this in the last episode, the Soviet infiltration of the American system, people even close to the president in the White House. So you think that this was a concerted effort involving espionage to fudge up the final stage of the war?
Well, it's interesting when U.S. 7th Army had an open path to cross the Rhine. 7th Army came from the landing in the south of France, which was different than the Normandy landings. They had a rapid victory on the German armies in the southern part of France and was able to rapidly advance to the Rhine. The German left flank was open. They could have crossed it. Eisenhower ordered 7th Army, and this is in the record of 7th Army, ordered them to not cross. And that obviously came from Marshall, right? And Marshall became head of the U.S. Army, the chief of staff of the U.S. Army, by Harry Hopkins. Harry Hopkins
Oh.
manipulated George, Marshall's appointment on 1st of September 1939. Interesting date, right?
Wasn't
That's when Marshall came
wasn't
into his job.
wasn't Marshall later removed from circulation from
No, that was his
Aitchison?
deputy.
Aitchison?
His deputy, Walter Bedell Smith, was removed as head of the CIA because he fell under suspicion as a Soviet agent. And Bedell Smith was not only the deputy of General Marshall at the time of the Pearl Harbor attack, but he was made deputy of Eisenhower in SHAEF, in Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Forces, which was Eisenhower's headquarters. And it's funny. Here's a guy who was later, you read Mark Riebling goes into this in depth in his book Wedge about Smith's background as a Soviet agent and what the evidence was against him. And the fact that Smith's FBI file is still classified is very suggestive. And the fact that the FBI came to Eisenhower days before Eisenhower's inauguration and said, you have to get rid of Smith out of out of the CIA. Smith was heading it at the time. This is going to become extremely significant later. So, and then you have Joseph McCarthy wrote the book Retreat from Victory, which I suggest everybody read. His indictment of George Marshall lied about where he was on the morning of Pearl Harbor. And this is
Yeah.
proven. And where was he? He was meeting with the Soviet ambassador Litvinov, who had arrived that morning of December 7th in Washington.
Yeah.
And so I think the Pearl Harbor attack happened like around 1 p.m., I think, if I'm remembering the time scales correctly, somewhere like that. And they were beginning to suspect that the war was going to begin that day, and they were trying to nail it down, and Marshall was nowhere to be found. And the question was, this intelligence officer wanted to send emergency warning messages to Admiral Kimmel and General Short in the Hawaii, and to MacArthur in the Philippines, and into the command in Panama. Which, of course, the warning was ultimately sent Western Union, and the boy with the bike was just delivering it to Admiral Kimmel as the Japanese bombs were falling. Too late, right, to do
Mm-hmm.
anything. So it Marshall's, people would say, oh, that's crazy. Marshall went on to become to actually arrange by negotiation the defeat of Chiang Kai-shek in the Chinese
Yeah.
Civil War.
And yeah, but
So
later
Marshall
Marshall.
was responsible, right? Yeah, he was sent as Truman's special envoy to China, from being the head of the general staff of the U.S. Army, and then he became Secretary of State. The Marshall Plan, remember?
Yeah, and didn't
And
Marshall
then when Korea was invaded by the Soviets, he became Secretary of Defense.
defense, right? And didn't Marshall at some point say we were not allowed to win the Korean War decisively? Because he
No,
was
that
alluding
was
to interference.
General. That was General Douglas MacArthur.
Right, right. But it was also
I
exactly
don't
it
know
was
how to
him.
bomb half a bridge, right?
It's just not allowed to win. Not allowed to win. Yeah.
Yeah, not allowed to win. And of course, that was again under Marshall as Secretary of Defense. So you have this Marshall problem. So you go back to the Battle of the Bulge and you look at Marshall cutting the replacements in advance, and Eisenhower, who was not an operational art of war guy, who was not really a capable commander. He was an able administrator, and he was a political general. He has these pleading letters to Marshall, tell me what to do, right? And Marshall comes back and is not very helpful, shall we say. So, realizing a disaster is unfolding, he gives half the American army group to Montgomery so that he can share the blame with the British, right?
Yeah.
Because if Montgomery's now in charge of part of the half of the American army group, then Montgomery can be blamed.
Right.
And of course, which is kind of funny. And then, of course, they did manage. You have Patton did an extraordinary thing. He was besieging, I think it was Metz, where he was engaged in siege warfare. He pulled his army out of his engagement, force marched it to the relief of Bastogne, which held the American paratroopers there, held up against the panzers amazingly. Was one of the things that caused the Germans to lose the war. The American paratroopers were such strong defenders. But the Germans lost the Battle of the Bulge, but Stalin won because two German panzer armies were ground to dust, and the Americans lost over 80,000
Mm-hmm.
casualties, dead and wounded. I mean, in American history, it's the most colossal destruction of American lives
Yeah.
of any battle.
Yeah.
And it
Exactly.
lasted from the 16th of December till around, I think, the 11th or 12th of January, when the Soviets then said, okay, now
How
we can move on the
how close?
Germans.
I mean, how close do you think? How close do you think was Stalin to getting his to implementing his dream plan? Because you talked about this was pretty close. This could have gone much worse, and then Stalin's position would have been so much better. So, how close would you describe Stalin to getting exactly what he wants, what he wanted?
Well, Stalin bitterly complained when he was congratulated on winning the war. He said, "Well, Alexander, Tsar Alexander the First got Paris.
Yeah.
I just got Berlin." He clearly wanted to go to Paris, and if the German armies at the at Battle of the Bulge, or what you Germans call the Ardennes offensive, if they had retaken Paris, retaken France, destroyed the British army, destroyed the American army group, um, then Stalin would have made it to Paris. And
Lenin stream.
and
Yeah, it
of course
was
he could have taken the Ruhr, right? Which goes to your thing. It's like when Stalin realized he wasn't going to get to the Ruhr, it's when now Hitler's ordered Walter Model to destroy the Ruhr. These are orders he gave to Model. And of course, Albert Speer talks about these orders to destroy the industrial infrastructure of the German people. And this is the interesting thing. There's the story of General Walter Model, or Model, I should pronounce it right. He he was very loyal to Hitler until this Battle of the Bulge. He saw through it. He saw something. He went and met with Hitler after it, and he had said to his colleagues, and you go to his biography, "I don't understand this Battle of the Bulge attack. It makes no sense to me. There's no reason to do this. It's just a waste of life and energy." And so, and of course, Model was one of the best generals of the war. Him and Rommel, and of course von Manstein were among the very great German commanders in the war. And so he can, after the Battle of the Bulge, he confronted Hitler. Now we don't know what the conversation was, but we know that when Model got back to his headquarters, and this is what was reported by his colleagues, he said bitterly, he said, "Hitler is a liar," which
right.
was, I mean, that was treason, right? You couldn't
Yeah.
say that. And he had been totally loyal to Hitler and believed in Hitler before that. Hitler is a liar. And then he started doing something he had never done before. He started drinking.
That never happened
Walter
before.
Model, the great field marshal, started drinking and calling Hitler a liar after the Battle of the Bulge.
That was close,
And
huh?
then when he got the order to destroy the Ruhr, because his Army Group A was there in charge of that area, you know what he did? He disobeyed the order. He told all of his officers, all of his men that could, to change into civilian clothing and
Hmm.
get lost. And he went into the forest and shot himself,
Wow.
right? So he did this one last good deed to stop the madman Hitler, but he realized Hitler was evil too late.
That
Should have
was.
realized it earlier, right?
Whoo boy. Whoo boy.
So this, I take these details as we don't have proof of it, but as a person who's looking at the higher strategy, so this is what I suspect, and I don't know if this could be validated by other things. I suspect there's other things to be found. My suspicion is that Hitler and Stalin came up with some kind of an agreement. Hitler knew the end was there when his whole army group was destroyed at Army Group Center in August of 1944. So Hitler said basically, "What will you do for me? Can you give me time?" And Stalin said,
Hmm.
"Oh yeah, put all your panzers and hit the Americans. I'll wait
Right.
until you do it. Then I'll come and get you." And then maybe there's these people that claim that Hitler survived the war. I don't know if that's true. It's possible. There's a mystery around Hitler's death, although the people in the bunker that survived, who by the way all were in Russian captivity for years,
Hmm.
say that he and Eva Braun took poison and Hitler shot himself. Then their bodies were placed in a crater and they were burned. Maybe when they were in captivity, the deal was, we release you from captivity and you tell the story.
Yeah. It
Because
was.
maybe what had happened is that Stalin had made a deal with Hitler. "I'll let you get away to Argentina if you
If you
do this
do this
for
for
me."
me.
Right?
Hmm.
Because it's kind of funny. There is this story that has emerged in recent years of the testimony that Hitler got away is really intriguing. And it's not to be dismissed out of hand, especially when all the other witnesses were in Soviet custody
Compromised.
so
Yeah.
long,
We're
right?
compromised. Right, and also the unusual death of Hitler. I mean, this especially the burning of the bodies, and then of course we get the stories of the dental his dental implants. There's a celebrated forensic expert in Germany, and his wife is also very well known, published a lot of books, and I read some of them. And so in this one book, this forensic expert was talking about this dental implant that Hitler had, because Hitler's teeth were horrible. He had these
Yes.
special implants made, and he was allowed to see that thing in Russia when he was I think it was in Russia when he was visiting there, and they stored it in a plastic box that was commonly used to put these floppy disks in them, or these old style computer disks. And so he looked at them, and then he did some comparisons with historical records and some medical records. But of course, it's just a piece that can be removed, right? I mean, it's like I always, when every time there's a forensic case to be made in a historical topic, I always try to look at this from a modern standpoint. How would an investigation be like today professionally, right? And then you can see if it matches those standards or if it does not. There's the same story with Martin Bormann. He disappeared and into nowhere, and at some point, I think in the 70s, two skeletons were found near a train station in Berlin, and supposedly, these bones contained fragments of Bormann's DNA, right? But it's not that hard to contaminate remains. It's not something that we would call conclusive by any means, and
Hmm.
it's the same kind of deal. We have sort of fragments, and these fragments have been in the hands of the Russians, and we cannot really tell for sure.
Well,
And
the head of
also,
the this is interesting. The head of the Gestapo, Heinrich Müller, supposedly died with Martin Bormann in Berlin, and his body was supposedly found. But then they decided there were people questioning his death. They held his funeral and everything, and they opened the grave, and it wasn't Mueller in the grave.
yeah, there's
So
a
Mueller, the head of the Gestapo, faked his death. Now there's the and of course he was this book, Spy Master, is about Sergei Kondrashev, who this guy, Pete Bagley, Lieutenant H. Bagley, became friendly with after the fall of the Soviet Union, briefly. Then the KGB said, don't talk to Bagley anymore. And what Kondrashev told Bagley was that, yes, indeed, Heinrich Müller was a Soviet agent,
mm-hmm,
and that Heinrich Müller was recruited by the KGB, and that he had met Heinrich Müller at a special meeting outside Vienna in 1955, which is astonishing because
yeah,
Reinhard Gehlen had obsessed over this in his memoirs. He said, "I know Mueller is alive. I think he's in Albania." This is what
mm-hmm,
Galen says in his memoir, that he went to Moscow. And Kondrashev has a slightly different version of this. There's also the claim that of course Martin Bormann was as well. Now we go back to Walter Schellenberg's memoirs, and it's right in there. This book is much older than all these other books.
yeah,
Schellenberg died not long after the war. He went to Nuremberg. He was tried, but they didn't hang him because he did save some Jews. He wrote his book, The Labyrinth, and in the book he tells how the head of the Gestapo, Heinrich Müller, tried to recruit him as an agent of Stalin. And anybody can go to the book and read it. And basically, the recruitment approach was, and this is after the Battle of Stalingrad, is the Russians are going to win the war. If you don't join Stalin now, you'll be for the high jump when the war. In
yeah.
other words, they'll hang you when the war is over. So join now and don't hang.
Yeah, and let's not forget, after the war, of course, the intelligence battle, became even more intricate. What's going to happen with Germany and all that, and so one player that got into this, of course, was Jewish Israeli intelligence, and so there was this one case. I have it in one of my books. It's this German official in I think it was in Hessen, and this German official with Jewish background, he got wind of one of these high-ranking Nazis, especially one who was tied to the Holocaust, escaping to Latin America, and he came across some bits of information that he then gave to the Israeli intelligence, and then only then were they really able to track this man down. So we know for certain that people escaped through these rat lines, what they call them. One place was Italy. You know, there was some places in Italy where these Nazis went, and then they got a new identity, were shipped to Latin America, but it really took some digging to really find some of these people. And I don't think anybody has. I don't think any. I mean, when you look at these people that were shipped over there, it's in certain countries it's fairly easy to take on or to maintain a false identity. If your friends in Italy, you know, your fascist friends, if they give you new passports, a new backstory, a new name, everything, a new haircut, you can preserve that new identity or create an entirely new one once you are in, let's say, Argentina, in these places. So they can even destroy your identity that you used for the transit period and then give you a new one and say, well, this is just Hans from the village that's lived here all his life. And they didn't have this bureaucracy in those target countries where you would have perfect records. And of course, we know that in places like Argentina, some of these Nazis or former Nazis, they ran entire communities. So they are in
Well, there's
control.
a large German
Yeah.
community in Argentina. I think
Yeah,
it's
you
more
can
than
buy.
a million
Yeah,
people.
you can buy German beer. You can buy basically German food everywhere. And these people have been in control over the records, the record keeping. And if you control the record keeping, you could say, well, this is Hans. He's been living here his entire life.
And didn't German intelligence support the Perón regime in Argentina? Wasn't
Oh yeah.
Juan and Eva
Oh
Perón
yeah, yeah,
basically
yeah.
German agents?
Yeah, I mean, at some point, these, some of these, I mean, this was in different places in the world, like Latin America and even in Western Germany after the war. Some of these former Nazis, they tried to create some sort of a bond with the Americans and promised they would help the Americans against the Soviets. And so some of these former Nazis were used in Latin America for certain operations, but it's incredibly hard to tell what side these Germans really were playing for. And there was this one colony. I think my wife visited that once because she was so interested in it. The Colonia Dignidad. This was a pretty famous case. There's a movie out there, a Hollywood movie of recent years. And so these were like these weirdo, devilish little communities that were tied into some of these new regimes that formed in these Latin American countries. And they tried to survive and they tried to create their own options by aligning with some of the Americans, or at least pretending to align with some of the Americans. And this was at a time when the fear was so great of the Soviet army, because the Soviets didn't really reduce their troops that much after World War II. They still had millions and millions of men under arms. And so some of these deals were made, and this even translated into a disinterest in the Holocaust, because the idea was, we need the German conservatives and the right-wingers. We need them against the Soviets, so let's not talk too much about the Holocaust. And one of the people who was also shaping this phase was John J. McCloy. John J. McCloy was in intelligence. He was in the war production in America. He was scaling up the American army. He was sort of the guy for everything. When he died, and he was a very secretive man, his funeral was almost like a statesman's funeral. He had all these guests coming there, these important people coming there. And McCloy was known to pardon people a lot. Now, of course, there were strings attached. So, for example, all these German corporations, these Nazi corporations, Siemens, Volkswagen at the time, Bayer, Höchst, future global players, by the way. Um, some of these people involved with these companies, they got pardoned, and they were probably recruited, and some of them got their money back, at least on paper. And so this was a very, very delicate phase, and because if you didn't play it the right way, Western Germany would have become so unstable that we would have been just overrun by the Soviets, which had I think hundreds of thousands or even more men in Eastern Germany stationed. This was an invasion army. They built bunkers on the German border, and these bunkers were always upgraded with new command centers for an invasion. Now, when they built the wall in 1961, they called it an anti-fascist protection wall, because they always play the victim. They expect to be invaded, but they wanted to be the ones invading. So this was a very delicate game that American intelligence had to play. And there's, I think, one good book on John J. McCloy. He became responsible for post-war Germany, and they called it the Hochkommissar für Deutschland. And there's this anecdote in this one good book about McCloy, right? There's this anecdote. President Roosevelt is calling McCloy in his office, and reportedly, we can't be certain if this was true, reportedly Roosevelt was making a very dark joke, and he was greeting McCloy with the words "Heil McCloy, Hochkommissar für Deutschland," and making some sort of a Hitler salute. So this was sort of the dark humor, and so people expected many Germans to be punished, especially from these corporations. But McCloy was tasked with rebuilding Germany, especially with these corporations, and especially implementing counterintelligence into every part and every bit of Western Germany, because this was incredibly important. Because, as we said, if the Soviets get a hold of all of Germany, if the Soviets get all of Germany, the Soviets have our technology, the Soviets have our technicians, and at some point in the next step, the Soviets could try to invade the United States and Canada.
They could control all of Europe, and yeah, that would give them the leg up. The other thing, we should mention the Morgenthau Plan, which another Soviet agent, Harry Dexter White, basically was one of the architects of. The Morgenthau Plan. Morgenthau was the Secretary of the Treasury, and this idea was floated that Germany was going to be deindustrialized, and Germany was, after the war, was going to be just turned into a giant farm, which of course would have been a disaster, would have destroyed the German people. In fact, Goebbels got a hold of this at the end of the war and told the German people, this is what this Morgenthau Plan is going to destroy the German people. It's a plan to exterminate Germany. And of course, it was used to make the Germans fight harder at the end of the war. So I just thought I'd mention this. Of course, it was dropped because there were at least enough sensible people like McCloy or whoever, and President Truman, who realized that we needed Germany to be stronger, to rebuild, to come back. And rather than to be punitive, we'd already punished Germany at the end of World War I. We're going to do it again and make them mad at us again. Somehow Germany had to be integrated into the Western, at least the Western part of Germany had to be integrated. This was actually sensible. And I see all these books out, Operation Paperclip, just denouncing the U.S. for taking in Nazi scientists. Well, what were we going to do? We were going to let the Russians get their half of the Nazi scientists, build all these super weapons, and we wouldn't have any? As it was, even with our Nazi scientists, the Germans put the first satellite into space with Sputnik, and they exploded the first working hydrogen bomb. We actually had the first hydrogen bomb. It was like a house that we blew up. But we were neck and neck with the Soviets in science. They were keeping up with us in the 1950s. So it turns out we actually needed those scientists to help us to be able to compete.
Yeah, and also these German scientists that went to the United States, they had sort of a an expiration date because they could only get to a certain point. They could hand over what they already had. They could help developing, but as we know, the Americans are fast learners. So at some point, these Germans were no longer needed, and also these Germans could never ever drive policy. There were all sorts of crazy ideas of some of these former fascists. This has been turned into movies over and over again, and so some legends. This was sort of this neo-Nazi idea that you could create this war, you could create or encourage this war between the United States and the Soviet Union, and when they exhaust themselves, the Nazis could rise again. So this was some sort of weirdo plan that was in the back of some people's
And
minds. But
and indeed, you have all of these conspiracy theory people that act as if the CIA was an extension of the Nazis. That because the
oh
CIA
yeah.
took in some of these people, and because Reinhard Gehlen came to Washington, was brought to Washington with his staff people, and they created a sort of a private intelligence service, which ultimately became the German official intelligence. That somehow that enabled them to take over Washington, which is ridiculous. Washington had
Mm-hmm.
its boot on their neck the whole time. They were using them for their assets and knowledge of the Soviet army and to gain Soviet intelligence. We should also say something about General Patton and his death. There is a book, I had it right here, on General Patton's death, claiming it was an assassination. There's been some very poorly done books, but this was a good one. Um, and it's the claim made by an OSS assassin who in Ohio, who in his latter days told the story that he was tasked personally by Wild Bill Donovan, the head of the OSS, to assassinate Patton, and that the book documents, so Stalin had put a hit out on Patton because Patton was telling American diplomats, look, you have to make the Soviets leave. You have to make the Soviet armies go home so that we can go home, because otherwise they're going to be there for generations and we're going
Yeah.
to have a problem. Patton was very far-sighted in his knowledge, and he also understood the Soviet armies had logistical problems, and despite their size, they could be beaten by a smaller American army. Um, there was an attempt to shoot Patton's plane down over Poland, was one of the assassination attempts. And but this guy in his old age who alleged that he had the plot was that they had created a road situation, a road accident situation, where this guy had gone where Patton had stopped and rolled down his window on the passenger side in the back seat where he was riding, and he fired a kind of air gun at Patton's neck, or at a vulnerable part in his neck that would kill him. But the guy missed, and it disabled Patton. It caused an injury to his spine. But that Patton was recovering, and this is a story you hear often. Patton's recovering and is actually going to go home, but then he suddenly dies in the hospital.
Hmm.
And so this guy said, look, I was assigned to kill Patton. I failed. He tried to go in the hospital once, but there were too many guards. And he just figured somebody else was sent
Mm-hmm.
to finish Patton off. We don't know the details, but this is an interesting story. Um, and I think it should be included because the Soviets did go out to say, and the other thing Patton was doing is he was getting together with the Ukrainians in Germany who had fled
Yeah.
the Soviet Union. And of course, you had Operation Keelhaul, which was when Eisenhower returned all these people. Stalin wanted all these people, these Soviet people who'd been taken prisoner, had fled the Soviet Union. He wanted them to return to the Soviet Union, where many of them were executed or
Mm-hmm.
worked to death in labor camps. And it was a horrific thing that we did. There's a book called Operation Keelhaul about this, and Eisenhower and the Americans and the British allowed this to happen, which should never have happened, by the way.
Yeah, because when the Nazis were done, the Soviet propaganda had to shift accordingly and sort of merge and change different things around because it was, I mean, it was always about agitating against what they call imperialism. Now the original socialist idea of the enemy was the capitalist pig, and they had this idea of late stage capitalism. So capitalism, according to them, was doomed to fail, and it would turn into something like fascism and wild imperialism. So during the war, of course, the Soviets, they had to play nice in public to some degree with the Americans and the British. You know, they were thought to be allies on some level, but as soon as the Nazis were done, the Soviet narrative shifted, and the main enemy of the Soviets, of course, overnight became the United States of America, and also to a lesser degree the British Empire, which then stopped being a traditional empire. And so this whole idea of branding anything American fascist imperialist, that became the new game in town. And when the Nazis were done, the British MI6, they had this idea of working with these Ukrainians and recruit Ukrainians, train them in Western Europe, and sending them back to liberate parts of Ukraine, for example. They were creating they were resurrecting some of these organizations like the Anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations, the ABN, and so this is when, for example, some of these Ukrainians got involved that used to have some fascist leanings because they were focused on the Soviet threat. And this became, of course, in recent times, became a major talking points of the Russians, because all they want to do is equate NATO with the Nazis. So NATO and America, to them, is the new Nazis, and it was the Soviets were wildly successful right after World War II, wildly successful of introducing these narratives in the Western world. And there was this plan of creating the resurrected plan of creating a safe corridor in Eastern Europe. They called it Intermarium. This was supposed to be between Western Europe and the Soviets, and so of course the British wanted to work with these Ukrainians, you know, regardless of what they were into in the past. And this went back to the 20s with British intelligence leaders like Stuart Minges and Wilfred Dunderdale and all these guys. And this has been quoted, or this has been referred to endlessly by the Russians in recent years, because the Russians wanted to excuse or to justify their invasion of Ukraine by saying there's this giant international right-wing imperialist world conspiracy, and the Russians are the only ones who are fighting this grand conspiracy. So of course, these moles, these Soviet agents like Kim Philby, they did anything they could to destroy this idea of a safe corridor, this Intermarium. And of course, these operations always failed. You know, in the Western intelligence community, they wanted to train these Ukrainians on German soil, you know, Western Europe, sent them back, but they were always captured. They were always reliably captured by the Soviets, because they knew in advance who was coming and what they had in mind. And even the British had this. The British had this thing with. This is the book on.
This is Robert Wilcox's book, Target Patton, The Plot to Assassinate General George S. Patton. And this is the book I'm mentioning. Before Robert K. Wilcox. He's a real historian. He's a World War II historian guy. So this is no joke. And he got it. His brother operated like an investigative agency that helped to recover people that were kidnapped and removed to other countries, and to find missing children. And this guy that claimed to have been assigned by Donovan to assassinate Patton was a guy who worked for him in his old age, and he revealed his story. So I think we don't know for sure, but this is something to consider, especially when we're looking at the Cold War narrative at the communist angle. And before we finish up on World War II, I should mention the Pacific, how similar the Pacific is in the way these things worked out. Um, the You had the communists in Mao in the Yunnan enclave in northern China, supported by Stalin, and of course the whole issue of Japan ending the war in the Far East was very important to the Soviets because they wanted an excuse after the fall of the Third Reich to get involved in the Far East so they could support Mao. And so it appears that there's important testimony comes from Robert Morris in a book called No Wonder We Are Losing, written in 1958. Morris was a naval officer. He was a lawyer, an American lawyer who became a naval intelligence officer during the war. And the man that he worked with, a friend of his, had set up this intelligence unit at the direction of Admiral Nimitz to determine to speak to Japanese officer prisoners. There weren't that many of them, to find out what would be reasonable surrender terms, because they knew the Japanese were not going to surrender unconditionally, because Japan, just because of its religion and culture, it was not going to do that. So they got these Japanese prisoners to tell them, look, if you let the emperor remain sacrosanct, surrender's possible. And of course, this was now, it came out recently that Japan had made feelers to try to surrender in January 1945. This was cited in newspapers, so I don't always trust newspapers, but about, what was it, 5-6 years ago. But this Morris story is even more interesting because they went to the State Department Japan expert with the report given by these Japanese prisoner officers saying this is how you can get Japan to surrender. He took it to President Truman, and after the surrender of Germany in May 1945, Truman liked it, and he wanted to offer Japan these surrender terms. Let the emperor stay and let's end the war. Give up everything else, but keep the emperor, basically. And but he wanted to pass it through his commanders.
Right.
So the Secretary of Defense, Forrestal, gathered all of the admirals and generals together in a room, along with the head of the United States Information Agency, who was the guy was a mentor to Walter Cronkite, for example, and Edward R. Murrow. And his name escapes me at the moment. But in that meeting, there's a famous congressional testimony, and Morris reproduces the congressional testimony about this in his book, about this meeting. And everybody, they went through all the generals and admirals, and they said, this is great. Let's end the war now. Right? This is May 1945. Let's end the war now. Japan will take this deal. Let's offer it to him. George Marshall, because the head of the United States Information Agency was enraged, we have to punish the emperor. We have to do bad things to him. He can't be let off the hook. And George Marshall, who was kind of the authority figure over everybody, especially over the Army generals, Army and Army Air Force generals, said, let's wait and do this later, right? Which is the Battle of Okinawa, 13,000 American dead later, and possibly Operation Olympic later. They finally, after Potsdam, Truman then offers this same deal to the Soviets. I mean, Marshall delayed it all that time, which allowed the Soviets to get into the war and invade Manchuria and Japan and take Manchuria, and to give all the Japanese military stores and weapons to Mao, the Chinese communist. And so this whole thing that Marshall engineered, by basically concluding this meeting with this voice of authority saying, no, we won't offer Japan this now. And Truman went with that. He was a new president. Roosevelt had just died in April 1945. This is May 1945. He hasn't been president more than several
Right.
weeks at the most, 4, 5, 6 weeks, maybe. He's been president. So this is what they do, which costs enormous Japanese lives, American lives, 2 atomic bombs that didn't need to be dropped because the Japanese would have taken those terms without the atomic bomb. It turns out. I mean, I think that's a conclusion. Douglas MacArthur was sick about this. Other American generals and admirals, especially the Navy admirals, were absolutely
Hmm.
sickened by the not entering the war right away. And this is the story of what happened and how the Soviets got into North Korea, China, and then we should begin with the Cold War next week, the beginning of the Cold War.
Right. So the whole Asian theater that changed so much in the following years. Because what was it? Especially with China, it was what 20% of humanity falling under communism, something of that magnitude.
It
That
it
was
was huge. I mean, China was the most populous country in the world even back
right.
then. Russia was the biggest country in the world with a very large population, larger population than the United States, both China and the Soviet Union had. So these are two huge countries, and and then Eastern Europe being swallowed up by the communists. So it was a tremendous victory, enlargement of communism achieved by Stalin, and it was achieved not only by manipulating Washington through its agents in Washington, like Harry Hopkins, and I believe was a Soviet agent.
Hmm.
Don't know for sure, but I think there's good reason to think he was. And of course, Harry Dexter White and Lachlan Curry, and um, Alger Hiss in the State Department, who was with Roosevelt at Yalta. And of course, Yalta was the big giveaway to the Soviets at the end of the war to consolidate their hold in Eastern Europe. And of course, we have Churchill's Fulton speech saying an iron curtain has descended, from Stettin on the Baltic to
Hmm.
Trieste in the Adriatic. It's this iron curtain thing. And of course, it was true.
Yeah, and obviously
Churchill was
the
right.
yeah.
In Churchill's history of the Second World War, he actually says, "I'm guilty. I participated in this, splitting this with Stalin," and he writes
Hmm.
about that very honestly. Um, because it was condemning hundreds of millions of people to oppression, and many of them to jail and death, and no freedom of speech, economic, poverty.
Yeah, and also the information war that happened alongside. Even in the early Cold War. I mean, the uh, just creating this image of China as something new. They always refer to it as something new is happening, something that a great experiment is happening in China, and the especially the culture war in the 1960s. With the music and the rebellion against the effort in Vietnam. So this became sort of the culture war that was waged alongside rebuilding and building up the Soviet Union and
Yeah, there was
communist
this
China.
effort to depict Mao as only nominally communist, that Mao was really an agrarian reformer. He was misunderstood. He was very American. He liked democracy, this kind of thing. And there was it was leading communists in the Roosevelt and Truman administrations that were behind a lot of this. There was
Yeah.
there we can get into a lot of this, but there were these organizations, and there was this group in the State Department,
Mm,
and of course it was toxic, and it
yeah.
allowed
And it
Mao ultimately to take over China.
and also the interior. I mean, this is also very interesting. We'll be getting into that, of course. The interior culture war inside communism, because for a long time, the citizens, serfs, whatever you want to call it, of the Soviet Union, these people were told that the situation, the day-to-day living situation in America was so bad that people didn't have milk, people didn't have access to basic you know, basic supplies. They were creating an entirely false image of what America was like, and they try to protect themselves from Western programs, Western depictions. Because if you watched any television show, or if you got to see anything of the West, they were driving around in cars. They were building apartments and houses for these American soldiers that came home. Because these men came home, they wanted to settle down, have a career, and have a family, and they needed space. And this is when this economic miracle happened, as they called it actually that in Germany. The Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. So people were driving around in nice cars. They were building houses, and they had more than one car. And it was just a complete distortion of reality. I used this example in one of my books. I put two images side to side. One of them shows the Soviet car that was popular in Eastern Germany, the Trabant, which was a tremendously underpowered small vehicle, very weak vehicle, very small, and it was based on, I think, an old Fiat design, an old Italian design, something like that. And the other image showed an American car that was becoming really popular, and that was the Jeep Grand Wagoneer. This was a large family SUV. I think it had all-wheel drive. It had air conditioning, and you could order these extras. So this was in completely different worlds. We were living in a completely different world than the Soviets lived in, but they kept that. To a large degree, they kept that reality away from the Soviet citizens, and they also tried to present a very distorted image to the West of what life was like within the Soviets. They showed these nice pictures, they told these nice stories of how people had, place to live, and nobody was worrying about job security and all that. And as you've explained so well in these previous shows, this culture war became sort of like the mainline strategy, which was also confirmed, of course, by the famous defectors, to weaken the West, create so much diversion until the West was ready to either collapse in some countries, or it was ready for a civil war, an uprising, or as was the plan for West Germany, the expectation that a leftist government in West Germany would simply capitulate when the Russians threatened war. There wouldn't even be much fighting. They would just say, "We agree to your terms. Please send us your tanks."
Yeah, that's the thing. The Russians always have dreamed of having Germany. And this is a key theme we're going to find in their strategy. Having Germany would guarantee the breakup of NATO and the dominance of Europe, because Germany they saw as the key to Europe. It just as Japan and China are the keys to the Far East. So I want to thank everybody. Thank you. Did you have any more comments to make now at the end of World War II?
No, because some of the rest of my notes, it goes into China and Korea, and that's for the next episode.
Yeah.
I mean,
of course,
yeah, I mean, there's some new studies out from America. I encourage people to read it. It's from the Army. They talk about the counterintelligence corps of the CIC, who was rebuilding Western Germany, and they were recruiting the politicians, obviously, and they were managing the large corporations. And counterintelligence was built into Western Germany, and this has been interpreted by the Russians as American imperialism. But we wouldn't have stood any chance whatsoever if it hadn't been for all these agents in place and all these mechanisms in place. Now, of course, there's always a difference between the agents who are actually doing the work and some of these, weirdos in Washington, some of them who might even work for the wrong side. It's important that these different countries understand each other much better. This is also part of this show, that the Americans look beyond, the American citizens, they look beyond, and they start to get interested in these other countries. And it's also important that, France, Germany, they understand America much better, because otherwise it's amazing how many Russian narratives have stuck in people's heads. It's like sometimes people don't even know it's Russian narratives because it's been filtered so much. But that's so important because the Russians always look globally, and the average American citizens, they've been told they need to look out for the American, mainland, the American states, and that's it. But you truly have to look beyond that.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us. We've completed World War II, our discussion, and we're going to begin on the Cold War next week and hopefully get into the Korean War. So thank you. I'm Jeff Nyquist, and this has been Alex Benish with me, and this has been Friends and Enemies.